Truth and Method, Hegel's reading of Spinoza. First about, okay, like that, thank you. First about the more geometrical corsets. And all the geometric demonstrator's expositions, such as that of Spinoza's Ethics, imply that a seemingly minor change in one of its postulates or the admission as valid of a change of the theorem may result in an integral transformation of the discipline and its results. In the case of such a particular change in the geometric exposition of Spinoza's Ethics, resulting in a radical transformation of the discipline, I would like to speak of a non-Spinozist metaphysics by analogy with non-Euclidean geometries. In this paper, I will propose to highlight an analogous change that transformed Spinoza's Ethics into something entirely different, albeit preserving some of the most important philosophical purposes of Spinoza's Ethics. In the panorama of the end of the 18th century, one can find a double image in Spinoza's reception. On the one hand, nature's generative capacity and dynamic infinity were stressed in correspondence with the notion of substance as Deus sive natura, and the distinction between natura naturans and natura natural. Accordingly, early romanticism had made, and I quote her mother, who is present here, Romanticism had made a generalized image of Spinozism in the form of a romantic pantheism, a living cosmos and organic unity. In contrast to that, another reading was present, based in part on the issue of the geometric method. I refer to the interpretation by Jacobi, who understood Spinoza's thought as atheism and his substance as inert, unproductive, and impersonal. As you know, one could hardly exaggerate the influence of Jacobi's reading, so one could not speak of Spinoza in German idealism, including its reception by Hegel, without starting with a reference to that reading. Due to his method and the completeness and perfection of his exposition, according to Jacobi, at least until the appearance of Fichte, Spinoza was the philosopher par excellence who took the coherence of pure understanding to its ultimate consequences. Jacobi thus subscribes to the oft-quoted claim, which he repeatedly attributes to Lessing, that there is no other philosophy than the philosophy of Spinoza. The motto Hen kai pan would contain that philosophy about which, according to Jacobi, Lessing said, I know of nothing else. One should remark that Hegel will explicitly assent to this interpretation in his lessons on the history of philosophy, where he confirms the already quoted today sentence that Spinoza ist Hauptpunkt der modernen Philosophie, entweder Spinozismus oder keine Philosophie. Thus, both the Aufklärung, as we may generalize from Jacobi's letters to Mr. Mendelssohn's, and under his influence, classical German philosophy, understood Spinoza's Ordine Geometrico Ethics as one highest point of modern philosophy is in its entire coherence. According to Spinoza's reception in Jacobian classical German philosophy, the more geometrical system of the ethics is a totality of mediation by the understanding. Jacobi defining the understanding as the faculty of mediation, given that, according to the latter, only immediate knowledge, which is inaccessible to understanding, can produce the truth. The Spinozist system, and with it all philosophy in general, lacks any truth. The substances living in productive nature on the one hand, and its sterility due to a method dependent on integral mediation by the understanding on the other, are therefore the primary and contradictory data confronting Hegel's reception of Spinoza. The transformation of Spinoza's system by Hegel focuses thus on 3 points. Firstly, it preserves in a different way the romantic notion of an infinite and radical productivity of the substance. Second, it accepts Jacobi's criticisms that the immobility of Spinoza's substance is due mainly to the inadequacy of the purely intellectual and external method. Third, while wholly accepting the criticism of the mediation by the understanding, Hegel directly opposes Jacobi's conception that only immediate knowledge can comprehend the truth. Considering Hegel's responses to these three essential points, we may define him also as a Spinozist. Hegel remains a Spinozist to the extent he submits these critical points from Spinoza to a methodological transformation which preserves them while grounding them in an entirely different and more comprehensive way. As said, first, Hegel changes the conception of the substance by linking together its infinity to its productivity. Second, this changed conceptions comes together with a changed methodological approach. Third, finally, against Jacobi, Hegel categorically refuses that one should find in immediate knowledge an answer to the insufficiency of the mediation by the understanding. By showing the insufficiency of the understanding, philosophy should not go back to immediate knowledge, but beyond it toward reason as the negation of negation. In answer to this problem, Hegel gave a new form to philosophical rationality. Therefore, once one decisive postulate of Spinoza's ethics, as said, has been changed, we can read Hegel as the Spinoza of contemporary times, as he proposes a system with equal coherence and completeness as Spinoza's. However, even more significant than just a methodological change in philosophy, the change proposed by Hegel does not constitute an alternative system of philosophy, but a shift of episteme. Philosophy being, as you know, its own time apprehended in thoughts, as Hegel in the Philosophy of Right says, this transformation corresponds to a transition from a modern episteme and a world conceived on a foundational unity of principle and substance to another episteme and another conception of reality, which integrates the freedom of the singular, conflict, complexity, and negativity. Thus, Hegel's thought allows us to encompass significantly different factors from Spinoza's world. Hegel's logic can incorporate negation and contradiction as a central element through that transformation. Hegel's metaphysics, endowed with negativity, allows us to understand reality from a much broader and more realistic perspective, opening it to understanding conflict and concrete historicity. To understand this change most simply, I began by suggesting that a single specific change in one of its theorems could, by analogy with the non-Euclidean ordine geometric of Gauss and others, completely alter the system of philosophy. I propose to expose Spinoza's critical reception by Hegel precisely based on such a small change. The element to be changed is the proposition 4 of the third book. This proposition states that, I quote, "No thing can be destroyed except through an external cause." End of quotation. The proof of this theorem reads as follows, I quote, "This proposition is evident from itself, for the definition of anything affirms and does not deny the thing's essence, or it posits the thing's essence and does not take it away." End of quotation. Hegel shows instead that this proposition is not evident at all, but everything finite must be destroyed through an internal cause, and that its essence and substance are precisely the absolute negativity of being, or absolute negativity of being. Despite some possible arguments to the contrary in the literature regarding dialectical factors in Spinoza's thought, proposition 3-4 of the Ethics corresponds to a stance coherent with Spinoza's geometric and analytical method. To ground my approach, I must then contrast it with some passage from Hegel's Science of Logic, stating the opposite. Indeed, contrary to the claim that Spinoza's claim that nothing can be destroyed except through an external cause, we read in Hegel's logic that, I quote, "Something behaves in relation to the other through itself. Since otherness is posited in it as its own moment, it in itselfness holds negation in itself." End of quotation. That is how Hegel intends to overturn Spinoza. Hegel continues, I quote, "Finite things are, but in their reference to themselves, they refer to themselves negatively. In this very self-reference, they propel themselves, beyond their being. The hour of their birth is the hour of their death." End of quotation. As a consequence of this change, Hegel opposes Aufhebung to the Spinozist conatus and perseverare. According to Hegel, things do not tend to persevere in their being, but to sublate their limits. And that's the whole difference. Now on the adventures of the substance. Contrary to some critics of Hegel, however, the question is not of opposing negativity to Spinozist's positivity and of persevering in the negative, as Hegel, quoting Hegel, in the sorrow of finitude, die Trauer der Endlichkeit, as Hegel says. Instead, the understanding, not dialectical reason, perseveres in the negative. I quote, "The understanding persists in this sorrow of finitude, for it makes non-being the determination of things, and at the same time, this non-being imperishable and absolute," end of quotation. Furthermore, I quote again, "The perishing, the nothing, is rather not the last of it, that is, the finite. The perishing rather perishes," end of quotation. Albeit founded upon negation, Aufhebung does not mean to persevere in the negative, in simple opposition to persevering in the positivity of the essence, as in Spinoza. Aufhebung is a link between the positive and the negative, not a simple opposition to the positive. According to Hegel, the conception of negativity as definitive and disconnected from the positive is a form of mediation through the understanding, or instead, it shows the impossibility of mediating opposites through the understanding. Hegel's conception of the essence as pure negativity implies the double negation, i.e., negation's negation. Such conception explains why essence perseveres and changes as double negation. It negates otherness and infinitely reaffirms itself. That is why essence is not positive being, as Spinoza seems to conceive it, but must be defined by negativity. Spinoza continues his demonstration in proposition 3.7 by identifying the conatus with the essence. I quote, "The striving by which each thing strives to persevere in its being is nothing but the actual essence of the thing," end of quotation. As he inverts Spinozism to recover its tenets more coherently, Hegel defines essence, on the contrary, not only as negation, but as pure negativity. I quote, "But essence is the absolute negativity of being. This negativity, which is identical with immediacy, and thus the immediacy which is identical with negativity, is essence," end of quotation. If essence was simple being, it could not persevere, since being, once determined, must pass away into its other, and that's the problem with Spinoza's definition. Only by negating otherness can being persevere. But as it negates otherness, being is the essence as negativity, as Hegel defines it. Hegel states that only this conception of the essential presence of negativity in the substance allows us to understand the speculative content of Spinoza's notion of causa sui. The expression causa sui means that the cause produces its effect as the other of itself, but identifies itself again in the effect as that other. It first negates itself to posit its other, but then negates the other to assert itself again, and that's essence. I should now present passages. Well, now I should present passages or a proposition in the science of logic, as I'd done before, capable of substantiating the diametrical opposition of proposition 4 above of book 3 of Spinoza's Ethics. Well, as I did before. Incidentally, I remark that is quite an easy task. It was very easy to do that. The only difficulty lies in choosing one among the indefinite number of possible propositions. The experience of searching in the science of logic for a statement to this effect shows that almost any sentence belonging to the argumentation of the science of logic can be quoted as an explicit position against the proposition above in Spinoza's Ethics. This fact shows that the change in proposition 3.4 implies a reconfiguration of philosophical method and procedures that affects the organic nature of thought at each step and in all its details, as in the science of logic. Of the three issues mentioned at the beginning, i.e., the renewal of the conception of the method, the productivity of the substance, and 3, the problem of immediate knowledge due to lack of available time, I can only deal now with the first one, the renewal of the conception of the method. Now I talk about Hegel's integrative method. Hegel conceives the geometric method as a set of rules and assumptions applicable from the outside to its object. It is the paradigm of what he calls external reflection. By proposing the use of dialectics, Hegel undertakes a genetic methodological change in such a way as to alter all the essential points of the method. Unlike the geometrical, the mos dialecticus, A, does not consist of rules, B, has no assumptions, C, does not admit of application, and D, much less from outside the object. So it's not a set of rules and assumptions applicable from the outside to its object. Everything is. For these reasons, all sentences in the science of logic are instances of statements opposite to Spinoza's propositions 3.4. As a general result of these features, I will define the Hegelian speculative method as integrative in the most comprehensive sense. This integrative capacity manifests itself in different ways. I will highlight 3 kinds of integrations relevant to understanding Hegel-Spinoza's reception. A, since it concerns the exercise we are now practicing, the first kind of integration to mention characterizes the study of historico-philosophical issues. This study must be carried out upon hermeneutically founded conceptions. Well, and here my Anspielung and Gadamer could find some development if I had time. The critical reception of the history of philosophy requires a clear conceptual framework and systemic integration. The integrative capacity of the method must give the history of philosophy a defined categorical meaning, removing the study of the different authors from the domain of contingency, arbitrariness, or museological interest. Therefore, one should not apprehend the history of philosophy as a random development, but as a relatively rational succession of principles. As you know, and the science of logic exposes the category of objective thought according to an order analogous to the course of the history of philosophy. I quote, "The same development of thinking that is portrayed in the history of philosophy is also portrayed in philosophy itself, only freed from its historical externality, purely in the element of thinking." End of quotation. As with other authors, Hegel's confrontation with Spinoza occurs in 2 different moments. The lecture of the history of philosophy explicitly presents historical critical materials extracted directly from the studied author's work. In that material, Hegel identifies the conceptual core of the author's thought, which makes it possible to prescribe its place in the development of the history of thought, its antecedents and consequences, as well as to criticize the insufficiencies of the development and speculative understanding of its specific principles. Given the parallelism between the history of philosophy and the science of logic, the latter articulates a new exposition of the same principles according to an ordering of pure thought, which does not follow the proper historico-philosophical order and materials. And that should be necessary in any hermeneutic, in any founded hermeneutics. Hegel thus defines clear hermeneutical parameters and explains the meaning structure that elucidates the history of philosophy. The integrative procedure, therefore, follows a speculative relation between the logical and the historical philosophical domains. We often find in the literature criticism of Hegel's assimilation of the history of philosophy. Regarding Spinoza's reading, one can read, for example, and I quote again from Mr. Moden to synthesize the idea, for example, that in a way, Hegel's reading is non-historical and unreliable. That is to say, it's most certainly a reading that takes us away from the immediate letter of the text and its historical context, often in an ashamed and quite apparent attempt at developing Hegel's own philosophical thesis. And yet, it does not do so by picking out useful positions and concepts and separating them from others. End of quotation. It does so according to a categorical ordering made explicit in the science of logic. This modeling of the object of study by a critical perspective on history is not a hermeneutic arbitrary caprice, but grounds on Hegel's categorical order, which must frame the meaning of the historical context. That seeming freedom in expounding the author or other author's thesis is clearly defined and justified by the divergence between logic and history of philosophy. Although closely related, there is a Spinoza specific to the science of logic and a Spinoza belonging to the lectures on the history of philosophy. The approach to the history of philosophy is a process of subsuming and inherence, Hegel thematizes in the logic, of simultaneous subsumming of historical content under logic determinations in the process of universalization of the particular, and on the other hand, of the inherence of the determination of thinking in the specific historical contexts, thus particularizing logical contents. Only in this way can one judge, rate philosophical questions, and seek answers. That is the practice of reading philosophy's history, as Hegel's systematic and integrative procedure tries to explain. Without this double key, hermeneutics would be an arbitrary and ultimately blind exercise. Now, about the second integrative way of Hegel's method. We should refer to a second integrative function, the already mentioned conception of the method as an inseparable connection between the content and form of the exposition. As mentioned above, the science of logic constructs all its propositions in such a way as to exemplify that each determination of thinking contains within itself its own negation, not require any, I quote, any external cause, as in Spinoza, i.e. an external principle for its sublation. Integration means that this connection between form and content is carried out in actu by the cognitive subject, and that the science of logic explicitly accounts for this same integrative connection. The conditions of linguistic meaning, especially of philosophical praxis, must always be made explicit in the logical categories. That is what logic is about. As expected, one can explain the relation between method and object, referring to the categories of form and matter explicitly addressed to in the doctrine of essence. The concept of content, presented as a unity of form and matter, or, as I quote, informed matter or form that possesses subsistence, end of quotation, bridges the gap between matter and form. Content is both in one, matter and form. That is why the method, as a way of thinking, is present and affects every moment of the exposition, all the content. Logic does not deal with a matter to which a method consisting of rules grounded on another source of knowledge would be applied, but it has a content that already consists of the unity between form and matter. For this reason, this unity between method and exposition permeates the entire work, and as we have noticed, the whole argument builds upon it. Besides these two kinds of methodological integration of the epistemological procedures, historico-philosophical and between logical form and matter, a third kind of integration is especially significant to understand Hegel's reception of Spinoza. Indeed, that is the most crucial innovation of dialectics, as opposed to Spinoza's mos geometricus. This integration could be summarized in a quote from Fichte in 1810. I quote from Fichte, "If a philosophy does not mention itself, it must deny itself," end of quotation. The point is critical, so that this could be an emblematic motto of German idealism. What is missing in Spinoza is the mention of philosophy itself. how does the philosopher how does the philosopher know what he asserts? Regardless of the more geometrical intellectual rigor characteristic of the ethics, it misses the essence of any truly philosophical method, reflecting on the philosopher's own procedure. And because speculation is a form of reflection, Spinoza's method, since it's not reflective, does not qualify as speculative, although the speculative virtuality of his conception of causa sui, as Hegel stresses in the history of philosophy. Moreover, given that the method is not external and prior to thought, but pervades it and constitutes the architecture of the content itself down to its details, this problem of the non-integration of philosophy in the exposition is an issue that affects the content of Spinoza's ethics. Indeed, due to lack of integration of the cognitive subjects, thought hangs in the air, outside substance and content, i.e. external to truth, without any place of reason for existing. The content becomes abstract. Hegel says that, I quote, "The movement of knowledge as a proof falls outside the propositions that should be the truth. That negative self-conscious moment, the movement of knowledge, which pursues its way in the thought which is present before us, is, however, certainly lacking of the content of Spinoza's philosophy, or at least it is only externally associated with it, since it falls within its self-consciousness. That is to say, thoughts form the content, but they are not self-conscious thoughts or concepts." End of quotation. The problem with Spinoza's geometric method is the lack of integration of the subject, which affects the conception of truth in both authors. For Hegel, Spinoza did not resolve the problem, which displays an essential discontinuity in the philosophical turn towards the 19th century. Historically, it involves the beginning of Hegel's systematic philosophical vocation and the transformation of Schelling's and Fichte's philosophy, especially the latter, as mentioned, as it's apparent in the introduction to his Wissenschaftslehre of 1812, but also increasingly in Hegel. The question is how to understand the integration of the subjective thought in any of its cognitive, epistemological, or historical dimensions in the content that philosophy studies. The Phenomenology of Spirit of 1807 is obviously a response to this very same problem. Regarding the lack of integration of the cognitive subject for Spinoza, I quote, "The human mind is a part of the infinite intellect of God. Therefore, when we say that the human mind perceives this or that, we are saying nothing but that God has this or that idea." Proposition 211 in his corollary. Moreover, the soul is for Spinoza the idea of the body. This conception defines the knowing soul as the knowing soul as a mode of the unique substance. However, Hegel's criticism is that it does not truly integrate the cognitive subjects, the soul, into the substance. Integration is lacking because the relationship between substance and mode is not made explicit. Integration, because the substance is unproductive, quoting Hegel, everything proceeds inwards and not outwards. No reason is given for the substance to express itself in its attributes and modes. Quote from Hegel, "The determinations are not developed from substance, it does not resolve itself into these attributes." End of quotation. Spinoza is aware that one should explain the cognitive subject, if not at the level of the status of philosophy itself, at least of perception. Therefore, the cognitive subject is said to belong to the one substance. Still, since as mentioned, the latter is not productive, Spinoza is in debt to convey how and why this happens. That is one insufficiency pointed out to Spinoza, which Hegel intends to respond to by the Phenomenology of Spirit. The issue is to raise the finite thought into the absolute knowledge and the pure element of science, followed by the exposition of determinations of thought as objective thoughts, not as representations belonging to some contingent, particular, finite subject anymore. For logical thought determinations to be considered objective thoughts, not subjective representations, one must overcome the separation between subject and object. Okay. And the pure logical element must be developed without presuppositions or the application of rules external to the logical content. But I couldn't elaborate further on this topic. According to Hegel, Spinoza failed in this integration process, especially in the cognitive and epistemological dimensions. Hegel seeks to resolve this problem through the transformation, as mentioned above, of the method and through the Phenomenology of Spirit, which is an exhaustive proposal of integrating the cognitive subject into the object of knowledge. Now to the conclusion, 3 epigraphs. Fichte's saying, quoted above, that if a philosophy does not mention itself, it must deny itself, expresses a central concern of German idealism of integrating the subject into the exposition of the object of science, whether at a cognitive, epistemological, or historical level. 2 other epigraphic statements from this philosophical period, one of which sets the stage for our colloquium, are closely related to Spinoza and simultaneously to the same methodological and cognitive problem of integrating the cognitive subject. First, Jacobi saying about building a Spinozism of freedom. As it's well known, Kant paid the recovery of freedom as practical reason at the price of fundamental dualism. The urgency of Spinoza of a Spinozism of freedom thus refers to the requirements of restoring a substantial monism, where the substance takes on the subject's characteristics, of which freedom is an essential moment. Well, how much do I have some time? 5 minutes. Oh, perfect. Okay. On the other hand, Spinoza's monist metaphysics of substance paid the price of a deflationary conception of freedom as free will. The most significant post-Kantian Fichte was thus faced with the question of how to treat freedom as a self-determination in contrast to freedom as necessity, as proposed by Spinoza's deflationary monism. Fichte's Wissenschaftslehre was the first attempt to solve the problem of a Spinozism of freedom, as it tried to integrate the subject as the absolute I at the core of the one substance. According to Hegel, however, monism built on the self-position of the I, could not integrate the different spheres, or one could say the attributes of substance received from Spinoza, thought and extended nature. The substance defined as a pure self-positing act of the I is no more productive than Spinoza's substance, defined as causa sui. The task is expressed in Hegel's saying that sets the tone for our conference. In philosophy, everything hangs on grasping and expressing the true, not just as substance, but just as much as subject. The philosophical task of exposing substance also as a subject is an apparent reference to Spinoza in the Phenomenology of Spirit, a work in which, curiously, Spinoza's name does not occur. Well, I will just point very shortly to the 3 problems, the insufficiency of Spinoza's philosophical method, but I said already enough about that. How Hegel makes the substance productive, according to aforementioned proto-romantic interpretation of Spinoza, and 3, how to construct a system of pure mediation capable of dispensing with immediate knowledge as a criterion of truth, responding thus to Jacobi's criticism of Spinoza without having to abandon rational mediation. Well, that's just some notes about that which I skipped. Now it's time to stop, and thank you a lot for your attention.
Thank you. And maybe we have 15 minutes for questions. Professor Hegel.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm obviously in broad agreement with a lot of what you said, but I do have one minor quibble, I suppose, and it's actually with the relevance of the quotation from Fichte. So, as I accept what you say is Hegel's critique of Spinoza regarding method, and I think, speaking personally, I would be broadly in agreement with that. Hegel's method Spinoza's method does indeed seem to be one of that begins with certain definitions and then derives ideas from that in what Hegel would regard as a kind of verständig way. However, from Spinoza's own point of view, he does mention his own philosophy. He does talk about his own procedure of demonstration. In fact, I'm just looking at a section now in the supplementary material, Scholium, to Proposition 36 in Part 5, and he refers back to his own demonstration, and the context in which he's putting it makes it very clear that he thinks that the demonstrations of the ethics belong to the second form of knowledge, not the third form and not the first form. So he's well aware of the status of his own thinking, and you could argue that, again, in Spinoza's terms, given the way that he derives, as he thinks about it, the infinite modes and then the finite modes of thought, and the distinction he draws between inadequate and adequate ideas, that in a sense, within his own terms, he's given an explanation of why it is that the ethics takes the form that it does. It takes a form of a series of adequate ideas that are kind of deducible from one another, roughly. So maybe I'm playing devil's advocate on Spinoza's part, but I think it's worth noting that Spinoza is perfectly aware of what he's doing. He does have a conception of his own philosophy. He's able to locate it within his own metaphysics. And so that charge that Spinoza is somehow not self-aware, which seems to be what's coming out of Fichte, I don't think is fair, personally, even though I would agree with other aspects of Hegel's critique that Spinoza's method is ultimately not satisfactory for philosophy. So anyway, I wondered if you'd like to respond to that. Do you think that's fair, or what I'm saying is wrong?
Should I answer?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for bringing some justice to Spinoza, who surely deserves it. Well, of course, if you read the treatise on the emendation of the understanding, if you goes on to the mode of knowledge, of course there is a self-thematizing of how to know the substance and how to know truth. Truth is the sign of itself. I'd like to speak about that in relation to Hegel, if I had the time to do that. I think, however, the great difference in reading the treatise on the emendation of the intellect, you find a totally Cartesian position, really a typical modern solution for the problem from, well, I must say, from a subjective perspective. And the question Hegel's and also Fichte's question later is, or Hegel solves the problem, I think, positing that kind of problem, I would say, at the level of subjective spirit, at the level of the faculty, of humans' faculties. How do we know something or something? But that is an epistemological question or a gnoseological question, which is not methodologically for Hegel is not important. It's just a secondary question. All gnoseology, all modern gnoseology, how we know, what are the kind of, what is the way we finite human beings know logical categories. Well, that's a secondary question. It's not. Since we have through the phenomenology or through the decision of thinking purely, well, that's another problem. But you are at the objective thoughts. The question of a first, second, or third mode of knowledge is secondary. If you would compare it with understanding and reason, well, I would say that there is objectively a treatment of this different ways of work with concepts that really make a difference between a subjective way of thinking and objective thought. Then I would answer that, well, Spinoza is not totally unaware, but first, he treats the question still at a subjective, gnoseological way, and two, he doesn't say really how and why the substance comes to know itself, or if...
Except thought is one of its attributes.
Yeah, okay.
So that would be Spinoza's explanation. Thought is one of its attributes, and thought necessarily gives rise to the infinite intellect.
Yeah, okay.
Substance
Okay.
must know itself.
Mm-hmm. Well, anyway, there is not a methodological way of producing the soul from the absolute, the substance. Well, substance has infinite modes, and soul is one of these. Thinking is one of these infinite modes. Well, okay, that's just a structure objectively presented without kind of proof that Hegel speculative searches. Of course, I must agree, I must confess that in some way I stereotypize, and Hegel also stereotypize a little bit, and we should proceed in more time and more at length. We should proceed with a less stereotypized way, with a less constructing figures that could be more with more flexible treatment. So you are in part right, I would say.
Okay. So Gregor Moder.
Hi, thank you. Thanks. Thank you. Yes, this was wonderful. I think my question is a little more clarification question, simply because you were very fast because of the time constraints. I'm not sure I completely understood you. But I wanted to first respond also to this discussion right now with Stephen. I think the problem for Hegel is even worse than that. Of course, Spinoza is aware of his own methods and of his own philosophy, but I think the problem for Hegel is that in a way, the method you use already reveals the weakness of your thought itself. In a sense, Hegel already assumes the idea that, you know, in a proper philosophy, there is no difference between truth and method. You basically, if you treat your mathematical method as a mere method, well, that's precisely your mistake. But I think maybe there's another way to defend Spinoza, and this is the question I put to you. There's a short text written by Warren Montag on Spinoza and Althusser, a very old text, but I think he defends there a position where he tries to align Spinoza closer to Marx, basically. And he argues in favor of, I think the title goes something like Spinoza and Althusser against hermeneutics. That's it, right? And he argues against interpretation and in favor of intervention. So I suppose that's, you know, he doesn't say Marx, but I think that's what he means. I don't know, do you have a response?
Well, I really couldn't thoroughly speak about that point insofar as intervention. Well, it's difficult to find. I don't know the text you refer to. It's not easy to find this bridge between Spinoza's concept of freedom and Hegel, and then Marx's concept of, or Hegel's concept of freedom and Marx's concept of action. It's this confrontation must surely be very rich, but I don't see a way to find what I take to be in the ethics the deflationary concept, an individualistic, an ethical, individualist ethical concept of freedom, of finding peace in a way of Epicurean way almost, or Stoicism, a Stoic way, and the idea of the history and action in history as you find in Marx. Well, but I'd like to hear more about that.
Okay, so I'm very sorry, but we have to close the discussion. I know there are other questions, and thank you again.